The Senate will come to order. The chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Eternal Father, who extends daily to our lawmakers compassionate love, we praise your holy name. Lord, in a challenging world where we often find ourselves waiting to exhale, you remain our shelter for every storm. Relieve the shadows of pessimism and cynicism as we face a world often filled with despair. Lord, bring our senators from the fatigue of doubts to the buoyancy of hope. Make their lives unflickering lights that transform dark yesterdays into bright tomorrows. Give them an unflinching certainty that you are sovereign. We pray in your great name. Amen.
Please recite with me the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Madam President,
The senator from Iowa.
I ask permission to speak for 3 minutes in morning business.
Without objection.
As the 119th Congress kicks off, I look forward to continuing my work for Iowans. As President Pro Tem of the Senate, Iowa is number one with my leadership. I look forward to working with my colleague, Senator Joni Ernst, to represent the people of Iowa and bring their views to the policymaking tables. The two of us will work with our colleagues, Congresswoman Mary Annette Miller Meeks, Congresswoman Ashley Hinson, Congressman Zach Nunn, and Congressman Randy Feenstra across the Capitol to represent the good people of Iowa. We are ready to roll up our sleeves and get to work. I just emphasized the Iowa delegation putting Iowa first. I do that at the same time we remember the voter mandate of the last election, to put America first. We will work with President Trump to bring that goal to fruition. On another point, yesterday, January the 6th, was Christmas Day for many Christians of the Orthodox faith. But during the Soviet Union, if you remember the history of the Soviet Union, Christmas had to be celebrated in secret, lest the communist authorities would find out and you'd be punished. The godless Soviet regime encouraged celebration the New Year with a visit from Grandfather Frost, a secular Russian folk character, in place of jolly Saint Nick. In a repeat of history, KGB dictator Putin, now President Putin supposedly, banned Santa Claus in occupied Ukraine. Christmas caroling, nativity scenes, and any mention of St. Nicholas were reportedly banned in Russian-occupied Ukraine for fear of spreading Western influence. A video recently came out showing the Russian military shooting down Santa's sled over Russia to the praise of Grandfather Frost. This is a war on Christmas, communist style. In Russia today, religious expression outside of the state-controlled church is discouraged. And in Russia-occupied Ukraine, all Protestant churches have been closed. The head of the Russian church is a KGB guy who answers directly to KGB Putin. It is no wonder then that only 16% of the Russians say religion is very important to them, and only 7% attend church weekly. It is also no wonder that most Ukrainians choose to celebrate Christmas with the West on the 25th, even while under rocket fire from Russia. I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
Madam President.
The Majority Leader.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I ask unanimous consent the quorum called be suspended.
Without objection.
Madam President, later today, President Jimmy Carter will arrive here at the Capitol for the last time. He will lie in state until Thursday in the Capitol Rotunda so that Americans can pay final respects to our nation's 39th president. Madam President, it's the great American story. How a man or woman can rise from humble origins to the highest levels of government or business or academia. And it was Jimmy Carter's story. Born in 1924 in Plains, Georgia, he grew up on a peanut farm in a house that had no running water or electricity. President was probably not the first thing people would have thought of when considering his future career. Most might have thought that he'd end up running the family farm, as indeed he did for a while. But he decided to also dip his toe into politics. And within 14 years, he had gone from taking up office in the Georgia State Senate to taking up office as President of the United States. His presidency was notable for a number of things, including his successful brokering of a peace agreement between Egypt and Israel, an agreement that stands to this day. But it was perhaps his post-presidency that came to define his legacy the most. Jimmy Carter left office in 1981, and during the 4 decades that followed, he dedicated himself to making a difference to the causes of peace and human rights, and to improving the well-being of his fellow man. Together with his wife, Rosalind, he founded the Carter Center, which, among other things, works for the eradication of disease in some of the poorest areas of the globe. Among the center's successes is the almost total eradication of guinea worm disease, a painful and devastating tropical disease whose cases numbered in the millions at the time the Carter Center was beginning its work. Through the first 10 months of 2024, there were just 7 reported cases. An incredible legacy for anyone, but just part of President Carter's. President Carter is also known for his work with Habitat for Humanity to provide affordable housing for those in need. And I do mean his work. President Carter didn't just lend his name or image to Habitat, he built houses. He nailed it, drilled it, he installed toilets. Well into his 90s, you could find him in the hard hat on work sites participating like any other volunteer. In one early Habitat project he and Rosalind worked on in New York City, the former First Lady and the former President spent the week sleeping in the basement of a church with other volunteers. A characteristic example of unpretentiousness from a couple who lived all their lives in the modest house in Plains, Georgia, that they built long before the presidency. All told, the Carter Work Project at Habitat for Humanity has worked on 4,447 homes in 14 countries, including homes in Eagle Butte in my state of South Dakota, which the Carters worked on during a 1994 trip to our state. It is unknown how many more homes have been built by volunteers who came to know about Habitat for Humanity through President Jimmy Carter. Madam President, it would be wrong to mention Jimmy Carter's years of service without mentioning what animated them. Jimmy Carter saw his service as the natural outgrowth of his faith in Jesus Christ. One of the best ways to practice my faith as a Christian, he would say, is to participate in Habitat projects every year. His life was about putting his religious principles into practice, whether that was through Habitat for Humanity or through his other work. And of course, anyone attracted by his example who wanted to learn more about the Christian faith could head down to Maranatha Baptist Church in Plains, Georgia, to his Sunday school class, which he taught into his 90s. Madam President, I cannot close without mentioning Jimmy Carter's 77-year-long marriage to his beloved wife, Rosalind, who preceded him in death a year ago. And while I join all Americans in mourning the death of President Carter, I rejoice at the thought that he and Rosalind are again together before the face of their father. My thoughts and prayers are with the Carter's children, with Jack, Chip, Jeff, and Amy, and with their grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And I look forward to paying my respects to this public servant later today. Madam President, I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
The Majority Leader.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President, I understand that there is a bill at the desk that is due for a second reading.
The clerk will read the title of the bill for the second time.
S5, a bill to require the Secretary of Homeland Security to take into custody aliens who have been charged in the United States with theft and for other purposes.
Madam President, in order to place the bill on the calendar under provisions of Rule 14, I would object to further proceeding.
Objection having been heard, the bill will be placed on the calendar.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate recess today from 12:30 to 2:15 to allow for the weekly conference luncheons.
Without objection. Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will begin a period of morning business, with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Madam President,
The Democratic leader.
Madam President, last week, 14 people were killed in a terrorist attack in New Orleans, and an explosion in Las Vegas injured several others. The FBI has warned that other attacks that copycat what happened in New Orleans could be a threat. Cities like New York, population centers like Long Island, need to be prepared. There is one federal program that stands as the cornerstone for anti-terror preparedness for places like New York City and Long Island, the Urban Area Security Initiative, known as UASI. Today, I'm announcing that I will request $615 million for UASI in the upcoming funding negotiations this spring. UASI is one of our best firewalls for staying vigilant against terrorist threats. My request of $615 will help communities like New York City, Long Island, and the entire metropolitan area stay ready against acts of terror. Last year, I was proud to deliver $2.3 million in UASI funding for both Nassau and Suffolk County. That's over $4.5 million in anti-terror funds just for Long Island this last year. I know these funds are critical for these communities and for people's safety on the island. I'm also proud last year that we delivered another $150 million to New York City in this funding. We must keep this robust funding going this year, too. UASI funds help pay for everything needed to keep people safe, from training and joint anti-terror operations across the city and Long Island, to emergency medical equipment, to better tools for Homeland Security offices, for intelligence sharing, and for so much more. We need UASI funds to keep people safe here in the nation's capital, too. Over the next few weeks, millions will come for inauguration, for paying homage to former President Carter, and many people will be moving in and out of the city as the government enters a period of transition. Strong UASI funding is vital to ensuring security during all these events. I want to be clear. Any effort to cut this anti-terror program, especially right now, cannot stand. We in New York and on Long Island use these funds on a rolling basis. We need these funds. And to repeat, UASI funds are a firewall at a time potential copycat attacks like the FBI are happening on Jimmy Carter. This morning, Special Air Mission 39 took off from Georgia carrying the 39th President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, so he may be honored here in the Capitol one last time. For the next 2 days, President Carter will lie in state in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol building, joining the small and distinguished list of eminent Americans who have earned this honor. Later today, I'll join Leader Thune and other congressional leaders in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol to place a wreath on President Carter's casket on behalf of the United States Senate. Today and tomorrow, Americans will brave the snow and cold temperatures to pay their respects to one of the most decent men ever to hold office of president. He was a gentleman in every sense of the word, kind, honorable, intelligent, humble, deeply patriotic. These are virtues he brought to the Oval Office in an era when trust in government was arguably at a low in the 20th century. But just as admirable as the legacy President Carter built after holding the most is the legacy President Carter built after holding the most powerful job in the world. After leaving office, he established the Carter Center to continue his work on human rights, spreading democracy, fighting disease. And we all know about his work with Habitat for Humanity, where he could often be found outside building houses for families in need, well into his 90s. That was President Carter at his core. He never stopped serving others until his final day. America was lucky to have him as a citizen, as a president, and as a moral compass of our time. Now, on the 119th Congress. As the 119th Congress begins, our nation faces an uncertain future. Americans still see high prices every time they go to the store, when they go to the pharmacy, when they refill their tank, and pay their cable and internet bills. We've done a lot of work over the last few years to slow inflation down, but the new majority must continue the work we've begun. Donald Trump and Republicans made a slew of very bold promises on the campaign trail to fix our country's big problems. In some of these promises, they say they will fight for working people, despite decades of doing the opposite and proposing things that would hurt them. Democrats will hold Republicans' feet to the fire to ensure they are accountable to the American people. Promises to help working people sound nice, but they mean nothing without real results. And too many of Republican promises, like tax cuts for the very wealthy, will actually make things worse for working people. In the coming weeks, there will be one early sign that shows whether or not Republicans intend to keep their promises to fight for working people, and that is who they support through the nominations process. These nominees are going to be the faces of the new administration. They will be responsible for applying its policies. They will, in effect, be the ones responsible for following through day to day on the promises made on the campaign trail. So the American people want to know, will the President-elect's nominees follow through on cutting costs for the American people? Or will they return to cutting sweet deals for mega corporations and the wealthiest people in this country? Will the President-elect's nominees actually make communities safer? Or will they protect the bottom line of special interests? Will they help their corporate contractors cozy up to foreign entities and oligarchs, while undermining our national security? Will they spend time settling scores for President-elect Trump, or will they actually help keep America safer? Will the President-elect's nominees keep their promises to serve America, or are they just going to serve the swamp? We remember what happened during the first Trump administration. The swamp wasn't drained so much as doubled and tripled and more. Even during the last campaign, Donald Trump promised oil executives huge tax breaks if he won. That would be the opposite of the promises he made to the people. These are the kinds of things we need to know from the President-elect's nominees. We need to be fair but thorough and give every nominee a chance to make their case while also subjecting them to some tough scrutiny. That is, after all, what any reasonable job application process demands, whether you're an average person applying for a job or somebody being nominated for a very important cabinet position. So that's what we Democrats intend to do. That's what we will do. It's no different than what we intend to do on the legislative side. I will repeat what I said last week. Democrats are ready to work with anyone, regardless of party, to make life better for working people. Let me mention one example from last week. On January 1st, because of what the Democratic Senate, the President, did, the $2,000 out-of-pocket cap that Democrats passed in the Inflation Reduction Act went into effect. Thanks to that policy, millions of Americans with Medicare Part D will save thousands of dollars each year on prescription drugs. If Republicans want to strengthen policies like these and help Americans save millions more on health care spending, Democrats are open to working together. But our promise to Republicans also comes with a warning. Democrats will not hesitate to fight back if Republicans use their new majorities to hurt working families of America. If Donald Trump and Republicans use their new majorities to push the same old GOP policies of tax cuts for billionaires, cuts to health care, cuts to Medicare and Social Security, trickle-down economics, Democrats will fight back. If Republicans use their new majority to push policies that make life even more expensive for families, we will stand opposed. If Republicans go after Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid's people's paychecks, they will have to go through us. The choice is now in our hands of our Republican colleagues. They're now in the majority. They now have the responsibility. We and the American people will be watching. I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
The majority whip.
Thank you, Madam President. I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I rise today to talk about the threats to America's security and our Republican effort to fight back. On New Year's Day, 14 Americans were killed in a heartbreaking, deadly act of terrorism. Dozens of our fellow Americans were seriously injured as well in the carnage. These are people that were just celebrating the new year. Their attacker was a terrorist. He flew an ISIS flag. It was off the back of his truck. And as a result of the terrorist attack, he destroyed families, destabilized a community, and broke the hearts of so many, many Americans. The shock of this attack is matched only by the urgency of the message that it sends to our country. And the message is this: it is time to restore America's security and America's strength. Lives depend upon it. Well, to keep America safe, we need to refocus our government on the priorities that matter to the people of this nation. And we've seen this in real time in terms of the danger of the distorted priorities of the last administration. Their priorities were a wide-open border, a woke Pentagon leader, a weaponized and distracted FBI, a feckless foreign policy, and of course, a weak president. The current president's absence of leadership has made America and the world less safe. In 4 short years, our enemies have been emboldened. They've grown stronger, they're more aggressive, and they're more dangerous. America once worked to deny terrorists a safe haven. Now the terrorist strongholds are back. Today, terrorists control Afghanistan. They control parts of Syria. They attack American troops from bases in Yemen. And this is only part of it. Today, we face a serious security situation right here inside the United States. The New Orleans terrorists appear to have been radicalized while here in America. Over the past 4 years, over 300 individuals on the terror watch list, our own nation's terror watch list, they've crossed into our country boldly and illegally. Those 300, they're just the ones that we know about. We also know that Iran, the world's #1 state sponsor of terrorism, is actively funding anti-Jewish protests on our college campuses. President Biden did nothing. Instead of showing strength, he kept our borders open and continued to ignore Iran's aggression. Weakness in the White House put us here. Returning to strength will help lead us out. In 13 days, our weak and wavering president will be replaced by a president who is respected for strength and for boldness. We have seen failure up close. Americans will now get a very good look at what strong leadership looks like once again. President Trump and Senate Republicans will act for Americans' safety. The Senate's going to work to confirm President Trump's strong nominees through a fair and speedy process. It's important for the President to have his national security team in place as quickly as possible. Especially right now, personnel is policy, and President Trump's team is ready to act. The President's nominees are not a return to business as usual. No, not at all. They are motivated, they are skilled, they are committed to the safety and security of every American. Our national security depends on confirming them. The New Orleans attack proves it. To my colleagues, I would remind each and every one of them that the Senate's power of advice and consent is no excuse to delay and deny or to try to search and destroy. Last month, a sleeping woman in New York City was set on fire in the subway. She died. Her killer was an illegal immigrant. He was deported under President Trump, snuck back into this country under President Biden. Since 2023, he has lived, this illegal immigrant criminal murderer, lived in taxpayer-funded shelters here in this country. That's what we've seen the last 4 years. The current president's actions invited and allowed 10 million people to cross into our country illegally. Our cities are overrun and overwhelmed. It was weak border policies that got us here, put us in this position, and it is strong border policies that are going to get us back to safety. That means funding the border wall, deporting illegal immigrant criminals, restoring successful policies such as Remain in Mexico. Our goal is to empower President Trump to enforce the law. Republicans are also going to work to restore deterrence through strength, and then what we've seen is the politicization of our military. Without a military focused on lethality, we can't be strong. If these actions are taken, peace and safety, security and strength are not just possible, they will be coming very soon. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor. Suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
Are we in a quorum call?
Yes, sir.
I would ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, as you know, last Friday the Senate swore in new leaders for the 119th Congress. And in 2 weeks, the new Commander-in-Chief will be sworn in for a second time. We are 6 days into a new year, and people around the country are making resolutions for the new year, from everything from health to fitness, books to read, financial goals to meet. And as Republicans, now is a good time for us to do the exact same thing. We have our work cut out for us to help clean up the mess that President Biden and Senate Democrats have left us from the last 4 years. I believe our first and most urgent task is to confirm President Trump's nominees for his cabinet. The president won the election, and he's entitled to his team, absent extraordinary circumstances. It's simply impossible for the new administration to tackle the mountain of work waiting for them without their team of advisors who will lead critical government agencies. Without the president's cabinet in place, he cannot get the job done that he was elected to do on November the 5th. With this cabinet in place, we can get to work to implement the agenda that Texans and Americans across the country elected a trifecta of Republican leaders to accomplish. The top of our list of priorities is, of course, to secure the southern border. I represent a state with 1,200 miles of common border with Mexico. And sadly and tragically, under the previous administration's open border policies, it has been an unmitigated disaster. The crisis at the southern border is one that President Biden quite literally invited with his campaign rhetoric and with his administration's policies. He invited this crisis. This was perhaps the one campaign promise that he delivered on. The Biden administration set out to reverse many, if not all, of President Trump's policies from his first term, including the Remain in Mexico policy and Title 42. Under President Biden's watch, the Border Patrol are overwhelmed with record numbers of illegal migrants crossing the border. Border Patrol encountered more than 370 people on the terror watch list crossing between ports of entry during the Biden administration. We know there were roughly a dozen people who were part of the conspiracy that resulted in the death of 3,000 Americans on September the 11th, 2001. And now here we have 370 people on the terror watch list that crossed between ports of entry during the Biden administration. Well, that compares with well under 10 years under the Trump administration. But I think the point is pretty obvious. This is dangerous. And those are only the aliens who the Border Patrol encountered or apprehended. Remember that President Biden also set records for gotaways. That's what the Border Patrol calls the people who've simply evaded law enforcement. Aliens who fled because, frankly, they were up to no good. As of May, more than 1.7 million gotaways had made their ways into the United States under their watch. And these are just people who triggered various cameras and sensors and were able to evade law enforcement. Surely there were more that were able to make their way into the interior of the United States. Again, under President Biden's border policies, all you have to do is turn yourself in and you would be released into the interior. But these are people that could not even risk that because of either their criminal records or their intentions to do harm, including carry drugs into the United States. Since the Biden administration established the word asylum as a magic word that resulted in your release in the interior, we can be pretty sure that many of those evading Border Patrol have something else to hide. Human trafficking and drug trafficking by the cartels have caused enormous and often untold suffering for the people of my home state of Texas and Americans as a whole. Fentanyl, which is now the leading cause of death of young people in America, 18 to 45, is manufactured, or the precursors are manufactured in China and trafficked through the U.S.-Mexico border. Countless migrants released into the interior of our country have failed to show up for their day in court, showing others looking to make the dangerous journey to the United States that they might also be able to make it and suffer zero consequences. All of these actions, or lack of actions from the Biden administration, have sent a clear signal that the law of the United States, the laws of the United States will not be enforced. You know, law enforcement depends on our great men and women in blue to investigate crimes and to deter other people from committing crimes. But deterrence is a very important element that has simply been lost by the Biden administration's open border policies. Given the fact that most people who come to the United States know under the Biden administration that you'll simply be released, there's no reason for them to believe that they will not be released as well, and so there is zero deterrence. That is getting ready to change under President Trump. Now, speaking of breaking the law without consequence, violent crime is another problem plaguing Texans and American cities across the country. Left-wing mayors and city governments have advanced soft-on-crime policies in major cities from Chicago to Los Angeles to New York to San Francisco. And what has been the result? Well, criminals have noticed that there are no consequences to them committing crimes in these cities. The lack of consequences is an incentive and encouragement for them to continue stealing, breaking, and murdering. That's all beginning to change under a new administration. Republicans are prepared to take steps necessary to prevent and ensure that ramifications for these crimes exist. And we've done so before, and we're going to do so again. During President Trump's first administration, I was proud to partner with him on legislation to lock up violent criminals and ensure justice for victims. One of my top priorities for the new year is to do everything I can to build on the great work we accomplished under President Trump's first term to make sure that our communities, our cities, and our streets are once again safe. Another way that we'll keep our citizens safe is by ensuring that Second Amendment rights are safeguarded. The Trump administration will end President Biden's assault on the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms, as well as the Biden administration's bad faith interpretations of Second Amendment-related legislation. I look forward to leading my Senate colleagues in reintroducing my Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act and working with the Trump administration and our co-sponsors here in the Senate to get this legislation across the finish line. Now, I know some folks from places like New York or maybe San Francisco might say, you're actually going to make it easier for people to carry a firearm legally? Well, the answer is already the vast majority of states have licensing regimes where responsible, law-abiding citizens can exercise their Second Amendment rights by getting a license to carry a firearm, including Texas and including the District of Columbia. I happen to have a license in both jurisdictions. And many states have gone simply to a non-licensed status so that people can exercise their Second Amendment rights. I would reiterate, America and Americans have nothing to fear from law-abiding citizens exercising their Second Amendment rights. Those are not the people that we should be concerned about. We should be most concerned about people who are criminals who cannot legally carry a firearm, or people with mental health incapacities which are currently prohibited under existing law from carrying or owning or possessing a firearm. Those are existing laws that are enforced given the National Instant Criminal Background Check System. Now, while our safety and security starts at home, in our communities and our borders, it also extends around the world. As I've said before from this floor, we now have the most dangerous geopolitical environment that we've had since World War II. Texans voted resoundingly for President Trump in this last election in part because of his pledge to hold China accountable. China threatens the peace in the Indo-Pacific by threatening to invade its neighbor, Taiwan, and interrupt freedom of commerce and freedom of navigation in the Indo-Pacific. One of the ways that we can hold China accountable is to pass my legislation to address outbound investment in China. I just had a chance to visit with the new Treasury Secretary nominee, and I told him it was really strange to me when you look at historically how we've dealt with the Soviet Union and how we've dealt with China, both of which are ruled by communist governments. Many years ago, at the beginning of the Cold War, George Kennan, a famous diplomat, wrote something called the Long Memorandum, where he said, "You are not going to change communist Russia. It's an ideological obsession they have. You're not going to change their minds, so what you need to do, what the free world needs to do, is to contain them." And that's what the Cold War was all about, leading ultimately to the fall of the Soviet Union. Strangely enough, the United States' position toward China was just the opposite. Under President Clinton, he invited them into the World Trade Organization, believing that somehow, by engaging in more trade with the rest of the world, that somehow China and the Communist Party would change. Well, as Deng Xiaoping, one of the former leaders of Communist China, said, "Hide your motives and bide your time." And that's exactly what China has done. China has now become the manufacturing center for the world. Now, when you're buying inexpensive consumer products, that's one thing. But when you consider the vulnerability of our supply chains and things that China makes and does, like processes critical minerals, which it does, 90% of the critical minerals in the world that we need for a variety of products, including military weapons, that represents a huge vulnerability. Well, we need to know who is investing in what industries in China, because right now, the rough estimate of the market value of American-based investment in China in 2020 was $2.3 trillion. Well, China has built its economy, which by itself should not be a big concern, but they've now become a rival to the United States. If they played by the rules, that would be one thing, but China is famous for not honoring intellectual property laws and stealing all the technology they can. And they are using their economic power, which is synonymous with their military power, because they have something called civilian military fusion laws, which said if the private sector creates a new innovative product, they have to share it with the People's Liberation Army and the Communist Party in China. So my point is, my outbound investment piece of legislation says we need to know who's investing money in China and what that is being used for. Now, I could care less if people want to build more Burger Kings or Starbucks in China. I'm not worried about that. But when you start talking about advanced semiconductors, when you start talking about serial intellectual property theft, when you look at some of the weapon systems and the airframes that China has been creating, they bear remarkable resemblance to those that we built here in the United States, because they've engaged in massive theft through cyber attacks and through intellectual property theft. But it's simply foolish for the United States to continue blindly, to continue to invest billions of dollars in the very defense systems and technologies that the Chinese Communist Party could use to our detriment in the Indo-Pacific. Our colleague, Senator Sullivan from Alaska, just retired as a colonel from the Marines, and he puts it very poignantly. He said, American investors are going to fund the very military buildup that will result in the death of my Marines if China were to invade Taiwan. To me, and I'm sure to all of us, that's simply unacceptable. But right now we are flying blind, and that needs to change. While some might be concerned about lost investment potential in China, there's plenty of opportunities here at home and in other parts around the world as we see more friend-shoring and near-shoring to create dependable supply chains to Asia, India, and elsewhere. Well, there's another area where I expect President Trump to make a big difference, and that is in the energy sector, and primarily to do this through regulatory reform. For the past 4 years, the Biden administration has put the wistful dreams of climate activists ahead of the interests of ordinary Americans, particularly those in my home state of Texas. And he's certainly not letting the door hit him on the way out. Today, I think that was actually yesterday, President Biden announced one last nail in the coffin by issuing a permanent ban on oil and gas leasing in certain federal waters, preventing new drilling. But nevertheless, Republicans will not be dissuaded from our task to reverse the damage of the Biden administration and unleash this huge asset, which is American energy. By removing burdensome regulations from our energy sector, by improving the permitting process so we can actually build things like the capacity to produce electricity that will drive data centers and artificial intelligence, and by increasing our exports of things like natural gas so our friends and allies don't have to depend on Russia to keep the lights on or to heat their homes, we can create both growth for our economy here at home, and we can improve our national security posture, including shoring up our vulnerable supply chains. Rather than forcing Europe to rely on Russia for its energy sources, we can increase their reliance, and they're eager to have it, on American energy, particularly liquefied natural gas. This would be a big win for America and a big win for my state as well, and a big loss for the axis of evil, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, that are working together to undermine the United States and the West. So, Mr. President, we have a lot to do and very little time to do it. We have an opportunity to pass huge wins for President Trump, and more specifically for the American people. And that comes first through the budget reconciliation process. This is a once-in-a-generation opportunity, and it's not an opportunity we can afford to squander. We can't let this go to waste by not taking this occasion to finally address our skyrocketing debt. And the only way we do that is not only to be responsible in the way we handle things like discretionary spending, but to dig deeper into the areas that the federal government spends, like mandatory spending. Now, I know Medicare and Social Security are particularly fraught, and without bipartisan support, it's really hard to save Social Security and Medicare, particularly if the Democrats aren't going to be willing to help. But there's about $700 billion a year that the federal government spends that is mandatory spending. That means it's on autopilot, and we never go back and revisit it to see if it's still a priority, which continues to grow at 5, 6, 7, 8% a year, and unless we deal with this mandatory spending, we are never going to deal with this mountain of debt, now approaching $36 trillion. And we have now finally gotten to the point where we're paying more money for interest on the national debt than we are on our own defense, which is 2.7% of our GDP. So we've finally kicked the can down the road to the point we've run out of road. That's true both in terms of our fiscal condition and in terms of our national security. We can't let this opportunity go to waste. And as I've said, we need to take a hard look at both our mandatory and discretionary spending, and we also need to take a look at how the tax code has been transformed into a welfare system. About $200 billion a year go to pay for the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit. And Democrats have been successful in decoupling any sort of work requirement for able-bodied adults that needs to be reinstated. Because when it comes to assessing the people who deserve help and need our help, able-bodied individuals should not be able to ride the backs of the American taxpayers. They need to do like everybody else does who is able-bodied, and that's to be a producer, not somebody who lives off of the beneficence of the American taxpayer. So we have a lot of work to do, but this is an incredible opportunity that I trust we will not squander. The time to address these problems is now. We've put it off long enough. I know it's easy to say, well, let's do the easy things now, and then we'll do the hard stuff later, but later never seems to come. And so we have to deal with these now. Mr. President, I yield the floor. President, I'd ask the unanimous consent that the Senate stand in recess pursuant to the previous order.
Without objection, the Senate stands in recess until 2:15 p.m.
Senate will come to order.
Madam President.
Majority Leader.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to consideration of SRS 16, which was submitted earlier today.
Clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 16 to constitute the majority party's membership on certain committees for the 119th Congress or until their successors are chosen.
Are there any objections to the proceeding of the measure?
Without objection, the Senate will proceed to the measure.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed to the measure.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to and the motion to reconsider be considered made, laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
Madam President,
Democratic Leader.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the consideration of SRS 17, which was submitted earlier today.
The clerk will report.
SRS 17 to constitute the minority party's membership on certain committees for the 119th Congress or until their successors are chosen.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection, the Senate will proceed to the measure.
I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
Madam President, I understand that there's a bill at the desk, and I ask for its first reading.
The clerk will read the title of the bill for the first time.
S9, a bill to provide that for purposes of determining compliance with Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972 in athletics, sex shall be recognized based solely on a person's reproductive biology and genetics at birth.
Madam President, I now ask for second reading, and in order to place the bill on the calendar under the provisions of Rule 14, I object to my own request.
Objection having been heard, the bill will receive its second reading on the next legislative day.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it stand adjourned until 11 a.m. on Wednesday, January the 8th, that following the prayer and pledge, the journal of proceedings be approved today, the morning hour be deemed expired, the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, and the Senate be in a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection, so ordered.
If there is no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it stand adjourned under the previous order.
The Senate stands adjourned until 11 a.m. tomorrow.